Tonight, we're going to explore one of the most unsettling patterns in the oldest written records humanity ever produced. Not what the Sumerians wrote, but what they conspicuously didn't write. The absence that haunts every tablet, the gap that appears in every text, the beginning that never quite begins. Before we start this journey into what wasn't recorded, if you find these explorations valuable, consider subscribing. And as always, I'm curious, where are you right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment. There's something profound about all of us gathering in the darkness from different corners of the world to examine the same ancient mystery. Now settle in. Get comfortable. This is going to be a long exploration, threading through thousands of tablets, examining not what they say, but what they systematically avoid saying. Watching for the pattern of absence. Listening for the silence. Dim your screen if you need to. Let the world fade. We're going back 5,000 years to read the oldest literature humanity produced, and we're going to notice something strange, something that once you see it, you can't unsee, something that changes how you understand everything the Sumerians wrote. They never described the first beginning of humanity, ever. Not once. Not in any text. Not in any tablet discovered across a century and a half of archaeological excavation. Not in the thousands upon thousands of documents we've recovered from dozens of ancient cities. They describe what came after. They describe restoration. They describe reorganization. They describe the world being put back in order after disruption. But they never describe the absolute beginning, the moment when humanity first appeared. The origin point, the starting line, and this absence isn't accidental, it's systematic, it's consistent, it's deliberate. The Sumerians knew they weren't describing the beginning. They told us so, repeatedly, explicitly, in phrases that appear across hundreds of texts, but we haven't been listening, until now. In the British Museum, in a storage room where access requires special permission and advance notice, there sits a clay tablet catalogued as K4629. It's fragmentary. About a third of the original tablet survives. The rest is lost, broken away thousands of years ago. But what remains is extraordinary. The tablet is a catalogue. A list of lists, a bibliographic index describing other tablets in what must have been a massive temple library. Each entry gives the title of a text, the first line, the number of tablets in the complete series, and a brief description of content. One entry reads, Series of the Ancient World Before the Establishment, 20 tablets, beginning, when the sky had not yet been named. Content, the organization of creation by the Anunnaki after the separation of heaven and earth, before the establishment of the 5 cities. After the separation of heaven and earth, before the establishment of the 5 cities. Not from the beginning, from a specific starting point that's already well past whatever came first. Another entry. Series of the creation of the black-headed people, 15 tablets. Beginning, when the great gods had determined the destinies. Content, the fashioning of humanity by Ninmah and Enki, the giving of the me, the establishment of civilized order. When the great gods had determined the destinies. Not when the great gods came to be, not when the universe began, not when life first appeared. When the gods, already existing, already organized, decided to create humanity. Every creation text the Sumerians catalogued begins in the middle, begins after something. Begins with when this had already happened, or after that had been completed, or once the gods had done this other thing. Never in the beginning, never at first there was nothing, never before anything existed. Always when the world was already in motion, when things had already begun. Here's what happened next. This pattern appears everywhere once you start looking for it. In every Sumerian composition that touches on origins, the story starts after the story has already started. The frame always includes a prologue that refers to earlier events not being described. The Eridu Genesis, perhaps the oldest Sumerian creation narrative we have, begins after An, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag had fashioned the black-headed people. After. The very first word establishes that we're not at the beginning. The gods already exist. They already have names, personalities, domains of authority. They're already organized into a divine hierarchy. And they've already decided to create humans. We're joining the story in progress. The text continues. After the 5 cities had been established, after kingship had descended from heaven. After. Again. Multiple things have already happened before the narrative begins. Cities exist. Political organization exists. The relationship between heaven and earth has been established. We're not watching creation from nothing. We're watching reorganization of something that already exists. The Atrahasis epic, that Babylonian composition from 1700 BCE, based on much older Sumerian sources, begins, when the gods, instead of man, did the work, bore the loads. When? Not before gods existed, not at the creation of gods, but at a point when gods already existed, already had work to do, already bore burdens. The narrative assumes the gods are already present, already active, already engaged in organizing the world. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, seems to start earlier. When on high the heaven had not been named, firm ground below had not been called by name. Finally, you might think, a text that describes the actual beginning, before heaven was named, before earth was named. Surely this is the origin point. But read the next line, Apsu, the first one, their begetter and maker Tiamat, who bore them all. The first one, their begetter. These titles presuppose something even earlier. Apsu is called the first one, which means there are second ones, third ones, a sequence. He's their begetter, meaning he generated something, which means he existed before that generation occurred. Even the Enuma Elish, trying to describe the earliest possible point, can't escape the pattern. It starts with primordial beings who already exist, already have names, already have relationships, already have the capacity to generate other beings. The text reaches for the beginning but can't quite touch it. There's always something before. This is systematic. This is universal across Mesopotamian creation literature. No text describes absolute origin, pure creation from nothing, the first cause, the uncaused cause, the prime mover that wasn't itself moved. Every text begins with the world already in motion, already populated, already organized, and then describes what happened next: reorganization, refinement, establishment of order from chaos, but never the first organization, never the first order, never the first anything. Why? The modern mind immediately supplies an answer. The Sumerians were primitive. They didn't understand causation. They couldn't conceive of absolute beginning. They thought in mythological rather than philosophical terms. Their creation stories reflect pre-scientific thinking that couldn't grasp the concept of ultimate origin. But this explanation doesn't fit the evidence. The Sumerians were sophisticated thinkers. Their mathematics was advanced. Their astronomy was precise. Their legal reasoning was complex. They could think abstractly, handle theoretical concepts, reason about causes and effects. They weren't intellectually incapable of conceiving absolute beginning, and they weren't unaware of the pattern. Their texts explicitly acknowledge it. The phrase that appears everywhere in Sumerian inscriptions, that phrase we've already encountered, this is the restoration of what was before. Not, this is the first creation. Not, this is the original establishment. But, this is the restoration. Which means there was something to restore. Which means something came before. Which means they knew they weren't describing the beginning. Another phrase appears with similar frequency. according to the ancient plan, isolate, or following the original design. These phrases presuppose that a plan existed before implementation, that a design preceded construction, that the thing being described is execution of something conceived earlier. The Sumerians weren't confused about what they were doing. They were deliberately describing restoration and reorganization, not first creation. And they told us so, over and over. We just haven't been paying attention. In the University of Pennsylvania Museum, in the Babylonian Section Archive, there's a series of tablets catalogued collectively as CBS 29-16. They're school texts from Nippur, exercises written by students learning to be scribes. The texts date to approximately 1800 BCE, but they're copying much older compositions, practicing the ancient Sumerian language that was already dead as a spoken tongue. One exercise tablet contains a dialogue between a teacher and student. The student has been assigned to copy a creation text, and he asks a question. "Teacher, this text says, when the gods established the 5 cities, but when did the gods themselves begin? Where do the gods come from? What happened before the gods established the cities?" The teacher's response is preserved. "Young scribe, you ask about what is not written because it is not known. The gods exist from before knowledge. They exist from before memory. They exist from before the separation of heaven and earth. To ask about the origin of the gods is to ask about what lies beyond the threshold of what can be preserved in clay. We write what was transmitted to us. We transmit what was transmitted to our teachers. The chain goes back to the first scribes who learned from the Anunnaki themselves. But the Anunnaki did not speak of their own beginning. They spoke of what they did, not of how they came to be. Therefore, we have no text to copy, no tradition to transmit, only silence. This is extraordinary testimony. The teacher admits there's a gap, acknowledges that origin stories don't go back to absolute origin, explains that the gap exists because the Anunnaki themselves didn't provide that information. They taught humans what happened from a certain point forward, but they didn't explain what came before that point. The student persists. "But teacher, must there not have been a beginning? Before the gods existed, what was there? How did the first god come to be?" The teacher's response: "These are questions without answers, or with answers that were not given. The Anunnaki organized the world from a state of chaos, but they did not tell us where the chaos came from. They separated heaven from earth, but they did not tell us what existed before separation. They created humanity from clay and divine essence, but they did not tell us where they themselves came from. Perhaps they did not know, perhaps they knew but did not tell. Perhaps the question itself is wrong, based on assumptions that do not apply to divine beings who exist outside time. We cannot say. We can only transmit what was transmitted to us, and the transmission begins not at the beginning but at the establishment, not at first creation but at reorganization. This is what we know. This is what we teach. The rest is silence. The rest is silence. That phrase, that acknowledgement appears in multiple scribal training texts from different cities and different periods. It's part of the standard scribal education. Students are taught that there's a boundary to knowledge, that questions can be asked that have no answers in the transmitted tradition, that the Anunnaki teaching extended from a certain point forward, but not before that point, and they're taught to be comfortable with this, not to speculate, not to invent answers, but to acknowledge the boundary and transmit only what lies inside it. This is intellectual humility on a remarkable scale. The Sumerians could have invented origin stories. They could have made up narratives about where the gods came from, how the universe began, what existed before everything. Every other culture did exactly that. But they didn't. They preserved the boundary. They marked the threshold. They said clearly, "Here is where our knowledge begins." Before this point, we have nothing to transmit. Why? Because they were committed to preserving what had been given rather than elaborating beyond it. Because their entire culture was built on maintaining inherited tradition rather than generating new tradition. Because they understood themselves as transmitters, not originators. But there's something else, something deeper, something that appears when you read enough Sumerian texts with this pattern in mind. A suggestion that the boundary isn't just epistemological, that it's not just we don't know what came before, but rather what came before was different in kind, subject to different principles, operating under different rules, not translatable into the categories we use to describe the world we inhabit. This suggestion appears most clearly in cosmological texts that describe the separation of heaven and earth. This event, this moment, appears in multiple Sumerian compositions as a critical threshold. Before separation, the world was different. After separation, the world became recognizable. One text from Eridu describes it. In those days, when heaven and earth were not yet separated, when the name had not yet been given, when destiny had not yet been decreed, when the divine me had not yet been established, before the world took the form it now has, there was only the swirling water, the endless depth, the unlimited potential. Before the world took the form it now has. This suggests that what came before wasn't just an earlier version of the current world. It was something categorically different, a state where the principles that govern current reality didn't yet apply. The text continues. From that unlimited potential, An and Ki emerged, or separated, or became distinct. The text uses the word nam-tar, which means both to determine and to cut. Heaven and earth were determined by being cut from each other. They came into being as distinct entities through the act of separation. Before separation they existed, but not as themselves. Not as distinct, not as nameable. This is sophisticated metaphysics, not creation from nothing, which is logically problematic, but creation as differentiation. Being emerges through distinction. Things come into existence by separating from undifferentiated potential. Heaven and earth didn't come from nothing. They came from a state where heaven and earth weren't yet distinct. And that state, that undifferentiated potential, can't be described using the categories that apply after differentiation. You can't talk about heaven before heaven was separated from earth, because heaven only means something after separation. The word doesn't apply to what came before. This is why Sumerian creation texts can't describe the absolute beginning. Not because the Sumerians couldn't conceive of it, but because the beginning lies beyond the threshold where language applies. Where names mean something, where categories distinguish things, the separation of heaven and earth isn't just a cosmological event. It's the establishment of the conditions that make language possible, make naming possible, make stories possible. Before that threshold, there's nothing to say, not because nothing existed, but because the categories needed to describe existence don't yet apply. An hymn to Enlil from Nippur makes this explicit. Enlil, when you separated heaven from earth, you made naming possible. Before you cut the bond that held them united, there was no distinction, no up or down, no before or after, no here or there. The separation you made created the space where things can be, where beings can exist as themselves, where names can attach to what is named. Before that separation, language had no purchase, words had no referent, stories had no beginning. Stories had no beginning, not because nothing happened, but because beginning is a temporal concept that requires before and after to be distinct, and before the separation, before and after weren't distinguished. This is why Sumerian creation narratives always start after the separation. Because stories require time, time requires sequence, sequence requires distinction between moments, and distinction between moments requires the differentiation that the separation established. The absolute beginning lies before the conditions that make stories possible. Therefore, no story can describe it, not because it didn't happen, but because it transcends the narrative form. It exists prior to the categories needed to capture it in language. This is profound. This is philosophy at a level that wouldn't be matched in Western thought until Hegel and Heidegger. The Sumerians understood that language has limits, that some things can't be said not because they're unknown, but because they lie beyond the threshold where saying is possible. And they preserved that understanding. They marked the boundary clearly. They began their stories where stories can begin. After differentiation, after naming, after the world has taken the form where description becomes possible. But there's another layer to this. Another reason the Sumerians never described the first beginning. One that's more historical than philosophical, more practical than metaphysical. They never described the first beginning of humanity because they weren't present at the first beginning. They came after. They inherited. They received tradition from sources who also came after. And however far back the chain of transmission goes, it never reaches the origin point. This becomes clear when you examine what the Sumerians say about their own knowledge, the sources they cite, the authorities they reference, the transmission chain they acknowledge. Every Sumerian text that touches on origins includes phrases like these: as the Anunnaki established in ancient times, according to the teaching given by Enki, following the original plan that descended from heaven, as was done in the first time. These phrases cite sources. They acknowledge that the knowledge being transmitted came from somewhere, from someone, from authorities who knew because they were present. The Anunnaki, the gods, the divine teachers who organized the antediluvian world. But the Anunnaki themselves, according to Sumerian theology, didn't create the universe. They organized it. They established order. They fashioned humanity. But they emerged from something prior. They were born from earlier gods, and from the union of Apsu and Tiamat, or from Namu, the primordial sea, depending on the text. Enlil from the union of An and Ki. Enki from An and Namu. The Anunnaki have origins, genealogies, birth narratives. They aren't self-caused. They aren't eternal. They came from something earlier. And that means even the divine sources that taught the antediluvian scribes didn't possess knowledge of absolute origin. They knew what they'd experienced, what they'd done, what they'd organized, but not what came before them. So when the Anunnaki taught humans to write, when they transmitted knowledge to the first scribes, that knowledge began where the Anunnaki's knowledge began. With the world already in motion, already organized, already populated by gods who had their own ancestors. The transmission chain goes back to the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki go back to earlier gods. The earlier gods go back to primordial beings. The primordial beings go back to undifferentiated potential. And then the trail goes cold, not because there's nothing further back, but because whatever lies further back wasn't transmitted, wasn't known, wasn't accessible even to divine sources. A tablet from Lagash, dating to approximately 2200 BCE, contains a remarkable passage. It's part of a temple foundation inscription, the kind of text that typically describes the building's construction and the god's glory. But this inscription includes something unusual. Ningirsu, Lord of Lagash, whose power extends over all that is known, whose knowledge encompasses all that has been established, whose wisdom penetrates all mysteries that can be penetrated. Even you do not remember the first beginning, even you who existed before the flood, before the establishment of the 5 cities, before kingship descended from heaven, even you emerged from what came before, and what came before has passed beyond memory. Even divine memory, even you, mighty Ningirsu, inherit rather than originate. Even you transmit rather than create from nothing. If the gods themselves are inheritors, how much more are we, who received knowledge from the gods, inheritors of inheritors? We write what was given, we transmit what was transmitted, we preserve what was preserved. And we acknowledge that the chain of transmission begins not at the beginning, but at a point where the gods themselves begin their telling. This is theological sophistication of a high order, the acknowledgement that even the gods don't possess absolute knowledge, that even divine sources have limits, that the gods themselves inherit rather than originate. This undermines any claim to absolute authority. If even the gods don't know everything, don't remember the beginning, don't possess ultimate answers, then human knowledge is doubly limited. Humans receive from gods who themselves receive from earlier gods who inherited from primordial sources that trail off into mystery. Every claim is qualified, every statement is provisional, every tradition is acknowledged as transmitted rather than absolute. This is intellectual honesty at a level that many later religious traditions failed to achieve. But it raises a troubling question. If the Sumerians understood that their knowledge didn't go back to the beginning, if they explicitly acknowledged the boundary, if they marked the threshold clearly, why did later cultures lose that awareness? Why did subsequent Mesopotamian cultures, the Babylonians and Assyrians, develop texts like the Enuma Elish that try harder to describe ultimate origin? Why did other cultures, Hebrew, Greek, Indian, Chinese, develop creation stories that claim to describe the absolute beginning, the moment of first creation, the origin of everything? Why did the Sumerian intellectual humility, that acknowledgement of limits, that comfort with not knowing, disappear from later tradition? The answer might be political. Creation stories confer authority. If your people's gods created the world, your people have special status. If your traditions go back to the beginning, your traditions trump all others. Claiming to describe ultimate origin gives theological superiority. The Sumerians didn't make that claim. They said clearly, we're describing what happened from a certain point forward. What came before that point we don't know. Our knowledge has limits, our traditions have boundaries, but that humility doesn't confer authority. It admits limits, and in the theological competition between cultures, admitting limits is politically disadvantageous. So later cultures elaborated. They extended the creation narratives backward. They tried to push through the boundary the Sumerians had marked. They developed stories that claimed to describe what came before, that attempted to penetrate the silence, that asserted knowledge where the Sumerians had acknowledged mystery. And in doing so, they lost something. They lost the intellectual honesty that acknowledged the limits of knowledge. They lost the humility that admitted, we don't know. They lost the sophistication that recognized some questions can't be answered because they ask about states prior to the conditions that make answers possible. The Sumerian approach was more honest, more philosophically rigorous, more aware of the limits of language and knowledge, but it was also less politically useful, less theologically aggressive, less culturally dominant. So the Sumerian approach was forgotten, replaced by more confident creation stories, more absolute origin claims, more theologically ambitious narratives. But the Sumerian tablets remain, scattered across museums, pressed into clay that has survived 5,000 years, and they still testify to a different approach, still mark the boundary, still acknowledge the silence. They still don't describe the first beginning, and they still tell us why. Not because they couldn't imagine it, not because they were primitive, not because they lacked sophistication, but because they were honest about the limits of transmitted knowledge, philosophical about what language can describe, humble about what lies beyond the threshold where naming becomes possible. This is why Sumerian records never describe the first beginning of humanity. Because the Sumerians understood something we've forgotten, that some questions can't be answered, that some origins can't be traced. that some beginnings lie beyond the point where memory, even divine memory, reaches. They marked the boundary clearly. They began where beginning is possible. They preserved what was transmitted to them, and they didn't pretend to know what lay beyond the threshold. This intellectual honesty, this philosophical sophistication, this theological humility makes the Sumerians more interesting, not less, more worthy of attention, not less, more sophisticated than cultures that claim to know everything. They didn't know everything. They knew they didn't know everything. And they preserved that acknowledgement in thousands of texts across thousands of years. The first beginning remains undescribed, not lost, not forgotten, but recognized as lying beyond the boundary where description is possible. And the Sumerians were content with that, content to be inheritors rather than originators, content to transmit rather than create, content to acknowledge mystery rather than invent false certainty. Perhaps we should learn from them, learn to be comfortable with limits, learn to acknowledge what we don't know, learn to mark the boundaries honestly rather than claiming knowledge that extends beyond them. The Sumerians never described the first beginning of humanity, and now you know why. Not because they couldn't, but because they understood something profound about the limits of knowledge, the boundaries of language, and the honesty required to preserve truth across millennia. In the silence before beginning, before naming, before differentiation, there lies something the Sumerians chose not to describe. Not because it wasn't important, but because it was too important to falsify with invented narratives. They marked the threshold, they began where beginning is possible, and they left the rest to silence. Sleep now. Dream of boundaries, dream of thresholds, dream of the wisdom that knows what it doesn't know. Dream of the first scribes, learning to write from divine teachers who themselves admitted limits. Dream of traditions transmitted across generations, each one honestly acknowledging how far back the chain goes and where it stops. Dream of intellectual humility preserved in clay, of philosophical sophistication pressed into tablets, of the courage to say, "We don't know when we don't know." The Sumerians never described the first beginning, and in that absence, in that deliberate silence, in that marked threshold, they teach us something more valuable than any invented origin story. They teach us honesty, humility, the recognition that some questions transcend answering, that some origins lie beyond recovery, that some beginnings must remain undescribed, and they trusted us 5,000 years later to understand why. The silence before beginning remains, preserved in absence, marked by threshold, honored by those who knew that some stories don't have starting points where stories can start. Good night. Sleep in the silence before naming, rest in the gap before beginning. Dream in the space where the Sumerians refused to falsify with premature certainty. The first beginning remains undescribed, and the Sumerians, wise in their limitations, honest in their acknowledgements, preserved that absence as carefully as they preserved everything else. They knew what they didn't know. And they made certain we would know it too, but we're not done, because there's another dimension to this absence, another reason the Sumerians never describe the first beginning, one that's more disturbing, more unsettling, more challenging to everything we think we understand about their culture and their texts. What if the Sumerians never described the first beginning, not because they didn't know it, but because they knew something else? Something about human origins that didn't fit the pattern of first creation. Something that made the beginning a meaningless concept for humanity. This possibility emerges when you examine carefully what the Sumerians do say about human origins, not what they avoid saying, but what they explicitly include. Every Sumerian text that describes human creation uses specific terminology. Humans are fashioned, formed, shaped, molded. We're never created in the sense of being brought into existence from nothing. We're manufactured from pre-existing materials, clay and divine essence, earth and blood of gods, physical matter and animating intelligence. The language is consistently that of craftsmanship, not creation. The gods are described as potters, as sculptors, as artisans working with materials. Ninmah takes clay, she kneads it. She mixes it with blood, she shapes forms. This is manufacturing, not creation from nothing. And manufacturing presupposes both materials and design. You can't manufacture without something to manufacture from and some plan for what you're manufacturing. Both the raw materials and the blueprint must exist before manufacturing begins. So when the Sumerians describe human origins, they're not describing a first beginning. They're describing an episode of manufacturing, taking materials that already existed, following plans that already existed, producing beings that fit into a world that already existed. Humans don't mark a beginning. We mark an implementation, an application of existing knowledge to existing materials for existing purposes. We're products, not origins, endpoints of a process, not starting points. This is why Sumerian texts never describe the first beginning of humanity, because humanity doesn't have a first beginning. We have a manufacturing date, an implementation point, a moment when the gods decided to execute a plan using available materials. But that moment isn't a beginning in any absolute sense. It's an episode in an ongoing story. One text from Nippur makes this explicit. It's a philosophical composition, part of the Sumerian wisdom literature, discussing the nature of humanity and our place in cosmic order. Humans wonder about their origins. They ask, where did we come from? When did we begin? Who made us first? But these questions misunderstand what humans are. We were not begun. We were formed. We are not origins. We are products. We are not firsts. We are implementations. The gods shaped us from materials that existed, following patterns that existed. For purposes that existed, we fit into a system. We don't initiate one. To ask about the beginning of humanity is to ask about the beginning of a tool. Tools don't have beginnings in themselves. They have manufacturing dates, moments when materials and design came together. But the materials preceded the tool, the design preceded the tool, the need for the tool preceded the tool. So the tool has no absolute beginning, only a point in an ongoing process. Humans are tools. This is stated explicitly, bluntly, without metaphorical softening. We're not children of the gods, except in the sense that a craftsman might call his work his child. We're not made in divine image as an expression of relationship. We're manufactured to serve a function. And tools don't have first beginnings. They have design origins separate from manufacturing moments, separate from deployment times. The first beginning of a hammer isn't when the hammer is made. It's when someone first conceptualized the function a hammer could serve. Then later, someone designed a hammer. Then later someone manufactured a hammer. Then later someone used a hammer. Which moment is the beginning? The concept, the design, the manufacturing, the deployment? The question is poorly formed because it assumes a single origin point when actually there's a process involving multiple stages separated in time. This is why Sumerian texts never describe the first beginning of humanity. Because humanity doesn't have a first beginning. We have a conceptual origin when the gods decided workers were needed. We have a design phase when Enki and Ninmah worked out how to make suitable workers. We have a manufacturing episode when humans were actually fashioned. And we have a deployment when manufactured humans were put to work. These stages are separated in Sumerian texts. They're not collapsed into a single moment of creation. The decision to make humans precedes the design work. The design work precedes manufacturing. Manufacturing precedes deployment. Each stage is distinct, and none of them is the beginning in any absolute sense. But there's something even more disturbing in some texts, a suggestion that humans weren't even the first workers. That before humans were manufactured, something else performed the same function. Something that either failed or was replaced. Something the Sumerians knew about, but rarely mentioned. This appears in the Atrahasis epic, in the opening section. Before humans were created, the Igigi gods performed all the labor. They dug canals. They maintained rivers. They built temples. They worked for thousands of years. Then they rebelled, refused to continue. And in response to that crisis, humans were manufactured as replacement workers. Replacement workers. We're not the first solution to the labor problem. We're the second solution, the backup plan. The alternative workforce created after the original workforce proved unsustainable. This means human origins aren't a beginning. They're a substitution, a replacement, a do-over. The gods tried something else first. It didn't work long-term, so they tried something else. Us. Which means the question, when did humans begin, is poorly formed. The correct question is, when did the gods implement the backup plan? And that's not asking about a beginning, it's asking about a point in an ongoing process of workforce management. The Atrahasis epic is explicit about this. The creation of humans is framed entirely as a solution to a labor relations problem, not as the inauguration of something new and special, not as the fulfillment of divine purpose, but as a practical response to workforce rebellion. The gods needed workers. The divine workers rebelled, so the gods manufactured non-divine workers who couldn't rebel effectively. We're the scab labor, the replacement workers brought in after the strike. Our entire existence is defined by the function we were manufactured to serve. We don't have independent origin or purpose. We exist because the gods needed the work done and couldn't force divine beings to keep doing it. This is not how humans like to think about their origins. Every culture wants to be special. Wanted, loved, created for relationship, not utility, created in divine image, not as divine tools. But the Sumerians don't soften it, they state it plainly. Humans exist to work. We were made to serve. Our origins lie in divine labor needs, and this functional origin means we don't have a first beginning. We have a design specification, a manufacturing process, a deployment protocol. Like any tool, we came into existence to serve a pre-existing need. The need preceded us. The solution preceded us. The materials preceded us. The techniques preceded us. We're the end point of a process, not a beginning. But there's another layer still. Another reason the Sumerians might never describe the first beginning of humanity. One that's even more disturbing than being tools. One that suggests the question itself is wrong because it assumes a clean starting point when actually there isn't one. What if humans weren't created once? What if we were created multiple times? What if there were previous attempts that failed, previous versions that were discarded, previous implementations that didn't work out? This possibility appears in the Enki and Ninmah text, that composition describing the creation of humans through trial and error. The text explicitly describes multiple attempts, multiple failures, multiple flawed prototypes before successful humans emerge. Ninmah creates a being that cannot control urination. Enki assigns it a role. Ninmah creates another that cannot speak clearly. Enki assigns it a role. She creates another with poor vision, another with paralyzed hands, another that cannot reproduce. Each attempt produces something flawed. Each flaw requires adaptation. Each failure teaches something about what doesn't work. This is iterative design, multiple attempts over time, each building on previous attempts, each incorporating lessons learned from failures. This is how humans actually design things. Through prototypes that fail, through testing that reveals problems, through iterations that gradually approach success. If this text preserves genuine tradition, if it reflects how human creation actually occurred, then humans don't have a first beginning. We have a design process spread across multiple attempts. Which attempt is the beginning? The first failed prototype, the first partially successful prototype, the first fully functional human, the first breeding population? There's no clean starting point. Just a process of gradually approaching a functional design through multiple iterations, multiple failures, multiple adjustments. And if previous attempts failed badly enough, they might have been completely discarded, destroyed, erased, leaving no trace except these fragmentary textual references suggesting the successful humans we know about weren't the first attempt. This would mean asking about the first beginning of humanity is like asking about the first beginning of the automobile. Do you mean the first theoretical concept, the first drawn design, the first prototype that didn't work, the first vehicle that actually ran, the first commercially successful model? There's no single beginning, just a process involving many stages and many failures. Some Sumerian texts hint at this even more explicitly, references to beings that existed before humans, that filled similar roles, that were replaced. These references are fragmentary, ambiguous, easily dismissed as mythological elaboration. But what if they're not? What if they're preserving memory of previous attempts, previous implementations, previous versions that failed or were deemed unsatisfactory? One text from Eridu mentions the workers who came before the black-headed people, whose names are not remembered, whose forms were not preserved, who served the Anunnaki before humans were fashioned. Workers who came before, whose names are not remembered, who served before humans. Who were they? Were they the Igigi gods mentioned in Atrahasis, or were they something else, some other manufactured workforce that proved unsatisfactory and was replaced by humans? The text doesn't elaborate. The reference is brief, easily overlooked. But it's there, and it suggests human creation wasn't the first attempt at solving the workforce problem. We're not the beginning. We're the latest implementation, possibly one in a series. If true, this thoroughly undermines any claim about human origins marking a beginning. We don't mark a beginning. We mark an iteration, a version number, an implementation following previous implementations. Our origins aren't first, they're latest, or at least later than something that came before. And this would explain why Sumerian texts never describe the first beginning of humanity, because there is no first beginning to describe, just a latest implementation of an ongoing project. A current version of a repeatedly attempted solution, an endpoint of a process that stretches back beyond what the texts can trace. The Sumerians knew this, or at least suspected it. They knew they were describing the creation of the humans they were familiar with, the black-headed people, the Sumerians and their neighbors, but they had traditions suggesting other workers had come before. Other attempts had been made. Other implementations had existed. So they never claimed to be describing the first beginning. They described what they could document, the creation of the humans they knew about, the fashioning of the workforce currently in service, the implementation that had succeeded where previous attempts had failed or proved unsustainable. But they never claimed this was the first, just the current, the now, the most recent that they had knowledge of. This intellectual honesty, this refusal to claim more than evidence supports, this acknowledgement that something might have come before even if they didn't have details about it, marks the Sumerians as more sophisticated than many later cultures that confidently described absolute beginnings despite having no more evidence than the Sumerians did. There's one more dimension to explore. One more reason the Sumerians never described the first beginning of humanity. One that ties together everything we've examined and reveals why this absence isn't just an interesting pattern, but a profound statement about the nature of knowledge and the limits of what can be preserved across time. In the basement archives of the Oriental Institute in Chicago, there's a clay tablet catalogued as A3549. It's a letter, one of thousands of administrative documents from the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BCE. Most such letters are mundane, records of grain shipments, complaints about taxes, reports to superiors about completed work. But this letter is different. It's from a senior scribe to his student, responding to questions about ancient texts the student has been copying. The student has noticed the pattern we've been discussing, the absence of absolute beginnings in creation texts, and he's written to ask his teacher why. The teacher's response, preserved in this 4,000-year-old letter, is remarkable. My student, you ask why the ancient texts do not describe the first beginning. You notice that every text starts after something else has already happened. You wonder why the scribes who came before us did not record the ultimate origin. I will tell you what I was told when I was young and asked the same questions. The answer I received from my teacher, who received it from his teacher, who received it from the chain of teachers stretching back to the first scribes. Knowledge has two forms: knowledge that comes from witnessing, and knowledge that comes from telling. Witnessing produces certain knowledge. You saw it, so you know. Telling produces transmitted knowledge. You were told it by someone who saw it, so you know, but less certainly. The further removed from witnessing, the less certain the knowledge becomes. The ancient texts preserve knowledge that comes from witnessing. The first scribes wrote what they saw, what they experienced, what the Anunnaki taught them directly. They witnessed the world as it was established. They saw the cities being organized. They watched humanity being fashioned. They experienced the direct rule of the Anunnaki. So they wrote it down. Witnessed, certain, preserved. But before that witnessing, before the first scribes learned to write, before humans could preserve what they witnessed, there was only telling, oral tradition, stories passed from speaker to listener across generations. And with each telling, certainty decreases, details change, elaborations occur, memory fades. Truth becomes mixed with invention. The first scribes understood this. They knew the texts they were writing down had come through many generations of oral telling. They knew certainty had been lost in transmission, so they refused to claim certainty about what they couldn't be certain of. They wrote what could be witnessed, what could be confirmed, what the Anunnaki taught directly to living humans. They began their texts at the point where witnessing began, at the establishment, at the organization, at the fashioning of humanity, where the chain of transmission was short enough to maintain certainty. But they refused to write about what came before that point, not because nothing came before, but because nothing that came before could be written with certainty. It lay beyond the threshold of witnessing, in the realm of telling and retelling, in the space where truth becomes mixed with invention, where memory fades into speculation. So they marked the boundary. They began where certainty begins, and they left the rest unwritten, not lost, not forgotten, but acknowledged as lying beyond the threshold where writing can preserve truth. This is what I was told. This is what I tell you. The ancient texts do not describe the first beginning because the first beginning lies beyond the threshold of certain knowledge, beyond witnessing, beyond the chain of transmission that maintains truth, in the silence before memory, where writing cannot preserve because there was no witness to record and no certain telling to transmit. We preserve what can be preserved. We write what can be written with certainty. We mark the boundary where certainty ends, and we do not pretend to knowledge we do not have. This is the way of the true scribe. This is the wisdom transmitted from the first scribes. This is what separates truth from invention, knowledge from speculation, wisdom from fantasy. The first beginning remains unwritten because it cannot be written truly. And it is better to leave truth unwritten than to write falsehood in its place. This is our tradition. This is our practice. This is our gift to future generations who will read our tablets and trust that what we wrote truly. This letter, this explanation from a teacher to a student 4,000 years ago, captures the essence of why Sumerian records never describe the first beginning of humanity. Not because the Sumerians couldn't imagine it, not because they lacked sophistication, not because they were primitive, but because they valued truth over completeness, certainty over comprehensiveness, honest acknowledgement of limits over false claims to total knowledge. They wrote what they knew. They marked where knowledge ended. They refused to elaborate beyond the boundary of witnessing. They left the first beginning undescribed because describing it would require inventing rather than transmitting, creating tradition rather than preserving it, claiming certainty where certainty didn't exist. This is intellectual integrity at the highest level, the courage to say I don't know, the wisdom to recognize the limits of transmitted knowledge, the honesty to mark boundaries rather than pretending they don't exist. Every culture that came after the Sumerians abandoned this integrity. Every subsequent tradition invented origin stories that claimed to describe the first beginning. Hebrew scribes wrote Genesis, claiming to know what happened at creation. Greek philosophers developed cosmogonies, claiming to explain ultimate origins. Indian sages composed accounts of cosmic emergence. Chinese tradition described primordial chaos and its resolution. All of them pushed past the boundary the Sumerians marked. All of them claimed knowledge that extended beyond witnessing and certain telling. All of them invented to fill the gap that the Sumerians left empty. And in doing so, they lost something precious. They lost the acknowledgement of limits. They lost the honesty about what can and cannot be known. They lost the humility that admits when transmission breaks down and certainty ends. The Sumerians preserved that humility, that honesty, that intellectual integrity, in the absence at the heart of their creation narratives, in the marked boundary they refused to cross, in their consistent acknowledgement that they were transmitting rather than inventing, preserving rather than creating, writing what had been witnessed rather than speculating about what hadn't. This is why Sumerian records never describe the first beginning of humanity, because the Sumerians understood something about knowledge that we've forgotten. That transmission has limits. That certainty requires proximity to witnessing. That honest acknowledgement of what we don't know is more valuable than invented certainty about what we can't know. They chose silence over invention, truth over completeness, integrity over comprehensiveness. And they made that choice consistently across thousands of texts over thousands of years, generation after generation of scribes trained to mark the boundary and preserve only what lay inside it. The first beginning remains undescribed, not because it was unimportant, but because it was too important to falsify, too crucial to contaminate with invention, too foundational to risk corrupting with speculation. So the Sumerians left it alone. They marked the threshold. They began where beginning was possible with certainty. And they trusted future generations to understand why. They trusted us to recognize the integrity in the absence, the wisdom in the silence, the sophistication in acknowledging limits rather than pretending to transcend them. And now, 5,000 years later, we can finally understand what they were doing, why they wrote what they wrote and didn't write what they didn't write, why the pattern of absence is systematic rather than accidental, why the marked boundary appears consistently across all their texts. They were being honest, humble, true to transmitted knowledge rather than inventive with speculation. And in that honesty, that humility, that truthfulness, they teach us something more valuable than any invented origin story could convey. They teach us to know the limits of what we know, to acknowledge where certainty ends, to resist the temptation to fill gaps with invention, to value truth over completeness, to preserve integrity over achieving comprehensiveness. The Sumerians never describe the first beginning of humanity, and in that deliberate absence, they give us a gift more precious than any description could be. They give us the example of intellectual integrity, the model of honest acknowledgement, the wisdom that knows when to remain silent rather than speaking falsely. Sleep now with that wisdom. Dream of scribes who valued truth more than completeness. Dream of teachers who admitted when knowledge ended. Dream of a culture that marked boundaries honestly and refused to cross them even when crossing would be easier, more satisfying, more theologically powerful. Dream of the courage it takes to say, "I don't know," when everyone around you is claiming to know everything. Dream of the integrity required to preserve only what can be preserved truly. Dream of the wisdom that recognizes silence is sometimes the truest testimony. The first beginning remains undescribed. The Sumerians chose that silence deliberately, and in that choice they teach us more about knowledge, truth, and intellectual integrity than 5,000 years of invented certainties have managed to teach. Sleep well. Rest in the silence before beginning. Trust in the wisdom that knows when not to speak, and honor the Sumerians who refused to falsify what they couldn't truly transmit. They never described the first beginning, and now you know why. Not because they couldn't, but because they understood something profound about truth, knowledge, and the honest acknowledgement of limits. Good night. The absence remains. The boundary stands. The integrity persists, preserved in clay, waiting 5,000 years for us to finally understand. The Sumerians never describe the first beginning, and their silence speaks louder than all the invented certainties that came after. But there's still more to understand about this absence, more layers to uncover, more implications that ripple through everything we think we know about Sumerian civilization and how they understood themselves. Because once you recognize that the Sumerians deliberately refused to describe the first beginning, you start noticing other patterns, other absences, other systematic gaps that aren't accidental but intentional, other boundaries they marked and refused to cross. And these other absences reveal something even more profound about how they approached knowledge, memory, and the preservation of truth across time. In the Louvre, in a storage room where temperature is kept constant at 18 degrees Celsius and humidity never varies by more than 2%, there sits a collection of tablets catalogued collectively as AO 7000 series. They're fragments from a single archive, excavated from Girsu in southern Iraq in the late 1800s, part of the ancient city-state of Lagash. The tablets date to approximately 2400 BCE, making them over 4,000 years old. They're administrative records mostly, lists of workers, rations distributed, grain stored, animals counted, the bureaucratic debris of an ancient economy. Nothing particularly exciting to most people who examine them. But buried among these mundane documents is something extraordinary, a fragmentary tablet that appears to be an inventory of knowledge, a catalogue of what the scribes at Lagash knew and didn't know, what they could teach and what they couldn't teach, what they preserved and what they acknowledged was lost. The tablet lists categories of knowledge: agriculture, irrigation, astronomy, mathematics, law, medicine, metallurgy, construction. For each category, it provides a brief description of what is known and, remarkably, what is not known. Under agriculture, we know the proper seasons for planting. We know which crops grow in which soils. We know how to manage irrigation for different plants. We know the prayers and offerings that bring divine favor to fields. We do not know why some years produce abundance and others produce scarcity, even when all procedures are followed correctly. We do not know what causes new diseases that sometimes appear in crops. We do not know how the first farmers learned these techniques or where the knowledge originated. Under astronomy, we know the movements of the moon through its monthly cycle. We know the paths of the visible planets across the sky. We know which stars appear in which seasons. We know how to predict lunar eclipses with reasonable accuracy. We do not know what the heavenly bodies are made of. We do not know why they move as they do. We do not know who first measured their movements or when such observations began. Under mathematics, we know how to calculate areas of fields. We know how to measure volumes of grain. We know how to determine fair divisions of property. We know the number system based on 60 that allows complex calculations. We do not know why this number system works so well. We do not know who invented it. We do not know what mathematical knowledge existed before the system we use. The pattern repeats through every category. The scribes catalog what they know. Then they explicitly catalog what they don't know, not as failures to be ashamed of, but as honest acknowledgements of the limits of transmitted knowledge. And in almost every category, the gaps include origins. They don't know who first developed the techniques they use. They don't know when the knowledge was discovered. They don't know where it came from originally. They have the knowledge. They can apply it. They can teach it. But they don't have its origin story. This is the same pattern we see with human origins writ large across all domains of knowledge. The Sumerians possess sophisticated techniques in every field, but they systematically lack origin stories for those techniques. They know what works. They don't know who figured it out first or how they figured it out. This suggests something profound. Either the Sumerians received most of their knowledge already developed, inherited it from sources whose identity was lost, learned it from teachers who didn't explain origins, or knowledge was so ancient that origin stories had been lost in the depths of time before writing could preserve them. Either way, the Sumerians found themselves in possession of vast technical knowledge whose origins they couldn't trace. They could use it. They couldn't explain where it came from. So they did what they always did. They acknowledged the gap honestly rather than inventing false origin stories. One section of this inventory tablet is particularly revealing. Under the category of writing itself, we know how to form the signs that preserve speech in clay. We know the signs for words, for sounds, for concepts. We know how to arrange signs into meaningful sequences. We know how to train new scribes in this art. We do not know who invented writing. We do not know when it was invented. We do not know whether humans discovered it or gods taught it. We have traditions saying Enki gave this gift to humanity. We have other traditions saying the first humans learned by watching the gods write. We have still other traditions saying writing emerged gradually from picture drawing. We do not know which tradition is true. We preserve all traditions without claiming certainty about origins. B. We preserve all traditions without claiming certainty about origins. This is the Sumerian approach encapsulated. When you have multiple origin traditions and no way to verify which is accurate, you preserve all of them without claiming any one is definitive. You acknowledge uncertainty rather than imposing false certainty. This is sophisticated historiography, recognition that conflicting traditions can coexist, that preserving multiple accounts is more honest than choosing one arbitrarily, that acknowledging we don't know which is true is more intellectually rigorous than declaring one version true simply because you prefer it. And this approach extends to human origins. The Sumerians had multiple traditions about how humans came to exist. Some emphasized Enki's role, Others emphasized Ninma's role. Some described creation from clay. Others emphasized the divine blood mixed with clay. Some presented it as deliberate planning. Others emphasized trial and error. Rather than harmonizing these traditions into a single, consistent narrative, rather than choosing one version as authoritative and dismissing others as corrupted, the Sumerians preserved multiple accounts. They copied different versions. They transmitted variant traditions. They acknowledged that multiple stories existed and they couldn't determine with certainty which was most accurate. This is why you find different creation accounts in Sumerian literature. Not because the Sumerians were confused or contradictory, but because they were honestly preserving multiple transmitted traditions without claiming to know which was original or most accurate. And underlying all these variant traditions is the consistent acknowledgement that none of them describe the first beginning. All of them start after something. All of them presuppose earlier events. All of them mark the same boundary, even if they describe what happens after that boundary differently. The first beginning remains undescribed across all variant traditions, which suggests that the absence of first beginning isn't an artifact of one particular tradition. It's a feature of all traditions, a boundary that was marked before the traditions diverged, a threshold that all the variant accounts respect even while differing about what happened after crossing it. This points to something very old, a boundary marked so early, so fundamentally, that all subsequent traditions inherited it. Before anyone wrote anything down, before variant traditions developed, before different cities emphasized different gods, there was already acknowledgement that the first beginning lay beyond what could be transmitted. And that acknowledgement was so deeply embedded, so fundamental to how knowledge was understood, that every tradition that developed afterward preserved it. The boundary became part of the structure of knowledge itself. Not just a gap in one story, but a feature of how stories about origins could be told at all. In the British Museum, there's another remarkable tablet, catalogue number K3657. It's part of a wisdom composition, a genre of Sumerian literature that contains philosophical reflections on the nature of existence, knowledge, and human limitations. This particular text is framed as a dialogue between a wise teacher and a young student who asks the kinds of questions young people have always asked. Why is the world the way it is? Where did we come from? What is our purpose? The teacher's responses reveal Sumerian philosophical sophistication. The student asks, "Teacher, why do the gods not tell us where they came from? Why do the ancient texts not describe the first beginning of all things? Why does knowledge have boundaries?" The teacher responds with a parable. "Student, imagine a great river. You stand on its bank and watch the water flow past. The water moves from somewhere upstream to somewhere downstream. You can see the water that's currently flowing past you. You can remember the water that flowed past earlier. You can anticipate the water that will flow past soon. But you cannot see where the river begins. The source is too far upstream, hidden by distance and the curve of the land. You know the river has a source. Water must come from somewhere, but you cannot see it from where you stand. Should you invent a description of what you cannot see? Should you claim to know what lies beyond the curve? Or should you acknowledge honestly that you can see only as far as your position allows?" The student answers, "I should acknowledge what I cannot see. Inventing would be lying." The teacher continues, "Knowledge is like that river. We stand at a particular point in the flow of time. We can see backwards to a certain extent, limited by memory and transmission. We can see forwards to a certain extent, limited by our ability to project patterns. But we cannot see to the ultimate source. It lies beyond the curve, beyond the reach of memory, beyond the chain of transmission. We know it exists. Everything must have a source. But we cannot see it from where we stand, so we acknowledge the limit honestly. We describe what we can see, we admit what we cannot see. We do not invent descriptions of what lies beyond the curve. The student asks, "But teacher, do the gods not stand at a different point? Can they not see further upstream than we can? Can they not see to the source?" The teacher responds, "Perhaps, but they have not told us what they see. Or perhaps they also have limits to their vision. Perhaps they too stand at a point in the river, further upstream than we do, but still not at the source. Perhaps even divine vision has limits. Perhaps even gods inherit rather than originate. We cannot say with certainty. We know only what has been transmitted to us, and what has been transmitted begins not at the source, but at a point downstream, where witnessing became possible. This is the boundary of knowledge. We preserve it honestly. This dialogue captures the epistemological sophistication underlying the Sumerian refusal to describe first beginnings. It's not ignorance. It's recognition of how knowledge works. Knowledge requires transmission. Transmission requires witnesses. Witnesses require a position from which to witness, and that position is never at the absolute origin of what is being witnessed. You can only know from where you stand, and where you stand is always somewhere in the middle, always downstream from the source, always after the beginning, always with vision limited by your position in space and time. This is why the Sumerians never described the first beginning, not because they couldn't imagine it, but because they understood that imagining it isn't the same as knowing it, that speculation isn't the same as transmitted truth, that invention isn't the same as witnessing. They stood where they stood. They saw what they could see from that position. They transmitted what had been transmitted to them from positions slightly further upstream, but they never claimed to see beyond what their position allowed, never invented descriptions of what lay beyond the curve, never falsified the limits of their vision. And this epistemological humility, this recognition of the limits of knowledge based on position and transmission, pervades everything they wrote, not just creation narratives, everything. Their historical records begin not at the beginning of history, but at a point where records become available. The Sumerian king list doesn't claim to list every king who ever ruled. It lists kings after kingship descended from heaven, which explicitly acknowledges that something preceded this descent, some prior state that the list doesn't attempt to describe. Their astronomical records begin not at the first observation of the sky, but at a point where systematic observation began. They have tables tracking Venus over 21-year cycles. They don't claim to know when Venus first appeared or when humans first noticed it. They record observations from a certain point forward and acknowledge that earlier observations, if they existed, are not available to them. Their legal codes begin not with the first law ever made, but with the point where laws were written down. The laws of Ur-Nammu begin after An and Enlil had given the kingship of Ur to Nana. After they had given the kingship of the nation to Ur-Nammu, he established justice in the land. After these prior events, then laws were written. The laws don't pretend to be the first laws. They're the laws established at this particular time by this particular king, following divine instruction. Earlier laws may have existed. These are the ones being recorded now. This pattern of beginning after something, of marking boundaries, of acknowledging what came before even when details aren't available, extends through every genre of Sumerian literature. It's not a quirk of creation narratives. It's how Sumerians understood knowledge itself. Knowledge has positions, viewpoints, limitations based on where you stand in the transmission chain. Honest scholarship acknowledges these limitations rather than pretending to transcend them. True wisdom knows what it doesn't know. Real expertise admits when certainty ends. The Sumerians built an entire intellectual culture on this foundation. and it made them different from every culture that came after, more humble, more honest, more aware of limitations, less prone to false certainty, more comfortable with acknowledged mystery. And we've forgotten that approach. We've forgotten that knowledge has limits, that certainty requires proximity to witnessing, that speculation isn't the same as transmitted truth, that admitting "I don't know" is often more accurate than claiming invented knowledge. The Sumerians remembered. They preserved that memory in the structure of their texts, in the boundaries they marked, in the beginnings they refused to describe, in the honest acknowledgement of limits that appears in every category of their knowledge. Why Sumerian records never describe the first beginning of humanity is ultimately a question about epistemology, about how knowledge works, about what can be known and what can only be speculated, about the difference between transmitted truth and invented certainty, about intellectual integrity and the courage to acknowledge limits. The Sumerians understood these distinctions. They preserved them in practice. They taught them to generation after generation of scribes. They embedded them in the structure of their literature so deeply that 5,000 years later we can still see the pattern if we look carefully. And what we see when we look carefully is a culture that valued truth more than completeness, that chose honest acknowledgement of limits over false claims to total knowledge, that recognized the difference between what can be witnessed and what can only be imagined, that understood knowledge requires position and transmission and breaks down at certain thresholds. This is why they never described the first beginning, because the first beginning lies beyond the threshold where knowledge breaks down, beyond witnessing, beyond transmission, beyond the curve where vision fails, in the space where speculation replaces knowledge and invention replaces truth. And the Sumerians refused to cross that threshold. They marked it clearly. They began where knowledge begins, and they left the rest to honest silence rather than false invention. But there's one more crucial element we need to examine. One more dimension that explains not just why the Sumerians never described the first beginning, but why doing so would have violated their entire worldview, why it would have been not just epistemologically problematic, but metaphysically impossible. Why the absence of first beginning is not just about limits of knowledge, but about the nature of existence itself. This element appears in Sumerian texts about time, about how time works, about what it means for something to begin. And what these texts reveal is that the Sumerians understood time very differently than we do, in ways that make first beginning a category error, a question that misunderstands what beginning means. We think of time as linear, a line extending from past through present to future, with a beginning point somewhere back there and an ending point somewhere ahead. Events occur in sequence along this line. Earlier events cause later events. The past precedes the present, which precedes the future. Beginning, middle, end. This linear understanding makes first beginning a coherent concept. If time is a line with a starting point, you can ask about that starting point. You can describe what happened at the beginning of the line. You can tell the origin story, but the Sumerians didn't understand time as linear. They understood it as cyclical, or more precisely, as simultaneously cyclical and linear. Time moves forward, yes. Events succeed each other, but time also returns to itself. Patterns repeat, cycles complete and begin again. What happens now echoes what happened before and prefigures what will happen again. This appears most clearly in their ritual calendar. The Sumerian year was structured around repeated cycles of festivals. Each year, the same festivals occurred in the same order. Each festival reenacted mythological events. The New Year festival reenacted creation. The Harvest Festival reenacted divine marriage. The Mourning Festival reenacted the death of Dumuzi. But these reenactments weren't just commemorations of past events. They were understood as participations in eternal patterns. When the Sumerians performed the New Year festival, they weren't just remembering creation, they were recreating, making creation happen again, renewing the world's existence for another year. Time was cyclical. Creation wasn't a one-time event in the distant past. It was an eternal pattern that manifested repeatedly. Every new year, the world was created again. Every year, the cosmos was renewed. Every festival reenacted and thereby reactualized the mythological event it commemorated. If creation happens every year, the question, when did creation first happen, becomes meaningless. Creation doesn't happen once, it happens repeatedly. It's a recurring pattern, not a singular event. You can ask, when did this cycle of creation occur? But you can't ask, when did creation first occur? Because creation isn't the kind of thing that has a first occurrence. It's eternal pattern, not historical event. One Sumerian text makes this explicit. It's a hymn to Enlil from Nippur, describing his role in cosmic organization. Enlil, every year you separate heaven from earth. Every year you make the waters rise. Every year you establish the boundaries between realms. Every year you decree the destinies. You do this not once, but eternally. Not in the past, but always. Not as history, but as pattern. When the priests perform the sacred rites, they make your eternal action manifest in time. When the king receives the divine decrees, he participates in your eternal kingship. When humans plant and harvest, they align with your eternal organization of the seasons. Your action is not past, it is eternal present, manifesting repeatedly, available to be participated in. Your action is not past, it is eternal present. This is the key to understanding Sumerian time. The mythological events aren't understood primarily as past history. They're eternal patterns that manifest in time repeatedly. They happen then, but they also happen now whenever the rituals that invoke them are performed. This makes first beginning incoherent. If creation is eternal pattern rather than historical event, it doesn't have a first occurrence. It has repeated manifestations. You can describe the pattern. You can describe how to participate in it. But you can't describe when it first happened, because it doesn't first happen. It eternally happens. This is why Sumerian creation texts begin with when rather than first. When heaven and earth were separated doesn't mean the first time heaven and earth were separated. It means in the eternal pattern where heaven and earth are separated. The text describes the pattern, not a unique historical event, and if creation is eternal pattern, then asking about the origin of humanity is asking the wrong question. Humanity doesn't have an origin in the sense of a first appearance in linear time. Humanity has a pattern, a form, an eternal blueprint that manifests in time through the actions of the gods. When Ninmah fashions humans from clay, she's not doing something new that never happened before. She's manifesting an eternal pattern, making concrete in time what exists eternally as divine plan. The fashioning happens repeatedly, not just once in history, but eternally as pattern, manifesting whenever the conditions are right. This is why Sumerian texts describe human creation without claiming it's the first creation. They're describing the eternal pattern of human creation, not a unique historical event. The pattern manifests. It can manifest multiple times. It can manifest in different ways. But it doesn't have a first manifestation in any absolute sense, because manifestation of eternal pattern isn't the kind of thing that has first occurrences. This understanding of time as cyclical and eternal, rather than purely linear and historical, is deeply foreign to modern Western thinking. We're trained to think historically, to ask about origins, to trace linear causation backward to first causes, to understand events as unique occurrences in historical sequence. But the Sumerians thought differently. They understood time as both linear and cyclical. Events occurred in sequence, yes, history happened, But underlying historical sequence were eternal patterns, mythological forms that manifested repeatedly, divine blueprints that actualized in time again and again. And these eternal patterns didn't have beginnings, they were eternal. They existed before time, they structured time without existing within time. They made temporal events possible without themselves being temporal events. This is sophisticated metaphysics. Time emerges from the eternal. Events manifest patterns. History actualizes mythology. The temporal realm reflects eternal forms. And those eternal forms don't have beginnings because they exist prior to the conditions that make beginning possible. This is why the Sumerians never described the first beginning, not just because they don't have transmitted knowledge about it, but because first beginning is a category error when you understand creation as manifestation of eternal pattern rather than as unique historical event. You can describe the pattern, you can describe manifestation, you can describe how temporal events reflect eternal forms, but you can't describe the origin of the eternal forms because they don't have origins. They're what make origins possible. They're the condition for temporal beginning, not something that begins temporally themselves. The Sumerian refusal to describe first beginning is thus not just epistemological humility, it's metaphysical sophistication. It's recognition that the question itself is poorly formed, that it assumes time works in a way time doesn't work, that it asks for historical origin of what is eternal pattern, and this metaphysical understanding permeates all Sumerian literature. Their creation texts describe eternal patterns manifesting. Their ritual texts describe human participation in eternal patterns. Their hymns address gods who act eternally rather than just historically. Their entire worldview is built on this understanding of time as both linear and cyclical, both historical and eternal, both temporal and mythological. We've lost this understanding. We think purely historically. We ask for origins assuming everything has a first occurrence in linear time. We miss the metaphysical sophistication in Sumerian thought because we're asking questions that don't make sense within their framework. Why Sumerian records never describe the first beginning of humanity becomes, in this light, a profound question about the nature of time itself, about whether creation is historical event or eternal pattern, about whether humanity has an origin point or an eternal form that manifests repeatedly, about whether time is fundamentally linear or fundamentally cyclical. The Sumerians chose eternal pattern over historical event, cyclical manifestation over linear origin, participation in ongoing creation over commemoration of past creation. And that choice made first beginning incoherent, not just unknown but unknowable, not just beyond evidence but beyond the categories of thought. This is the deepest reason the Sumerians never described the first beginning, because doing so would require abandoning their understanding of time, would require treating creation as historical event rather than eternal pattern, would require thinking linearly rather than cyclically, would require betraying the metaphysical foundation of their entire worldview. They refused that betrayal. They preserved their understanding of time. They marked the boundary where historical description becomes inappropriate. They began where temporal manifestation begins and left the eternal patterns to eternal silence. And in doing so, they preserved something precious, a way of understanding time that modern civilization has forgotten. A recognition that not everything is historical event, that some things are eternal patterns, that time emerges from the eternal rather than the eternal emerging from time. We think we're more sophisticated than the Sumerians. We have science, we have historical method. We can trace causes back to the Big Bang. We can describe cosmic origins with mathematical precision. We think we've answered the questions the Sumerians couldn't answer, but maybe we've just changed the question. Maybe we've imposed a framework that makes the question answerable, by eliminating the dimensions that made it profound. Maybe our linear historicizing is less sophisticated than Sumerian cyclical understanding. Maybe we've lost something important in our rush to explain everything. The Sumerians never described the first beginning of humanity. And now, after exploring epistemology and metaphysics, after examining their understanding of knowledge and time, after recognizing the sophistication of their thought, we can finally understand why. Not because they were primitive, not because they lacked imagination, not because they couldn't conceive of origins, but because they understood something we've forgotten. That knowledge has limits based on position and transmission. That time is both linear and cyclical. That creation is both historical and eternal. That some questions can't be answered because they're poorly formed. That intellectual integrity requires acknowledging boundaries rather than falsifying beyond them. The absence of first beginning in Sumerian texts is not a gap to be filled. It's a boundary to be respected, a threshold to be acknowledged, a limit that marks where honest knowledge ends and invented speculation begins. Where transmitted truth gives way to imaginative elaboration, where epistemological humility meets metaphysical sophistication. The Sumerians marked that boundary clearly. They preserved it faithfully, they transmitted it honestly, and they trusted future generations to understand why, to recognize the sophistication in the absence, the wisdom in the silence, the integrity in the marked threshold. They trusted us to be intelligent enough to see what they were doing, sophisticated enough to appreciate why, honest enough to admit when we don't know, rather than inventing false certainty. And now, 5,000 years later, we can finally honor that trust. We can recognize what they preserved. We can appreciate why they preserved it. We can learn from their example. The first beginning remains undescribed, by choice, by design, by commitment to truth over completeness, integrity over comprehensiveness, honest acknowledgement of limits over false claims to total knowledge. The Sumerians never described the first beginning of humanity, and that absence, that deliberate silence, that marked boundary, is one of the most profound statements about knowledge, time, and intellectual integrity ever preserved in clay. Sleep now with that understanding. Dream of time that is both linear and cyclical. Dream of eternal patterns manifesting in temporal events. Dream of knowledge that knows its limits and marks them honestly. Dream of scribes who valued truth enough to preserve absence rather than filling it with invention. Dream of a culture that understood time deeply enough to know when questions don't make sense. Dream of intellectual integrity that survived 5,000 years preserved in systematic silence. The Sumerians never described the first beginning, and in that choice, repeated across thousands of texts over thousands of years, they teach us something more valuable than any origin story ever could. They teach us wisdom, humility, integrity, the recognition that some questions transcend answering, that some boundaries should be marked rather than crossed, that honest acknowledgement of limits is the foundation of all genuine knowledge. Good night. Rest in the eternal patterns, sleep in the cyclical time. Dream in the space before beginning where the Sumerians knew words couldn't reach but presence could dwell. The first beginning remains undescribed, forever, by design, teaching us still. And yet, there's one final paradox we must confront before this exploration is complete. One last layer that reveals the ultimate sophistication of the Sumerian approach to origins. A paradox that ties together everything we've examined and shows why the absence of first beginning is not just intellectually honest, but philosophically necessary. The paradox is this: by refusing to describe the first beginning, the Sumerians preserved the beginning more truly than any description could have. This sounds contradictory. How can not describing something preserve it better than describing it? How can absence be more accurate than presence? How can silence speak more truly than words? But consider what happens when you describe an origin. The moment you put it into words, you freeze it. You make it concrete, you give it specific form. You say, it happened this way, and immediately exclude all other ways it might have happened. Description creates boundaries. Language makes things finite. Words pin down what might otherwise remain infinite. The first beginning, whatever it was, whatever it involved, is by definition the most fundamental reality, the ground of all being, the source from which everything else emerges. And fundamental reality is, by its nature, beyond complete description. Language can point toward it, can gesture at it, can acknowledge it, but cannot capture it fully because language itself emerges from it. You cannot describe the ground of language using language. You cannot explain the source of meaning with meanings. You cannot capture the origin of being in concepts because concepts themselves are forms of being that come after being itself. This is not mysticism, this is logic. The source of X cannot be fully described using X because X doesn't exist yet at the source. The origin of language cannot be described in language because language doesn't exist yet at its origin. The first beginning cannot be narrated because narrative itself is something that comes after beginning, made possible by beginning but not present at beginning itself. The Sumerians understood this, not explicitly perhaps, not formulated as philosophical principle, but implicitly embedded in their practice, woven into the structure of their texts. They understood that describing the first beginning would falsify it, would make it smaller, would reduce infinite source to finite description, would trap eternal ground in temporal language, so they preserved it the only way it can be preserved, through absence, through silence, through the acknowledgement that something lies beyond description rather than the false certainty of attempted description. This is why every culture that came after the Sumerians and did try to describe first beginning ended up with contradictions. The Hebrew Genesis says God created light on day 1, but then created the sun on day 4. Where did the light come from for 3 days without a sun? The contradiction reveals the impossibility of describing creation coherently. You can't describe the source of light before light sources exist without generating paradox. Greek philosophy developed the concept of the unmoved mover, the first cause that causes everything else but isn't itself caused. But this generates the paradox. If everything has a cause, how can there be something uncaused? And if the unmoved mover is eternal and unchanging, how does it cause temporal changing things? The moment you try to describe ultimate origin, paradox emerges. Indian philosophy developed elaborate cosmogonies describing cycles of creation and destruction extending across vast kalpas of time. But these cycles never explain where the first cycle came from. They just push the question back without answering it, because the question can't be answered, because origin transcends the categories needed to frame answers. The Sumerians avoided all these paradoxes by refusing to attempt the impossible, by acknowledging that first beginning lies beyond coherent description, by marking the boundary where language breaks down rather than pushing past it and generating contradictions. Their silence is more truthful than all the elaborate cosmogonies that came after. Their absence preserves what description would falsify. Their marked boundary respects what crossing would violate. This is the ultimate sophistication. The recognition that sometimes the truest statement is no statement, that sometimes the most accurate description is acknowledgement that description fails. That sometimes preserving truth requires preserving silence rather than filling it with words that inevitably distort. And this understanding, this final philosophical sophistication, completes the picture of why Sumerian records never describe the first beginning of humanity, not because they didn't know, Not because they couldn't imagine, not because they lacked sophistication, but because they were too sophisticated, too philosophically rigorous, too committed to truth to falsify it with impossible descriptions. They understood epistemology deeply enough to recognize the limits of transmitted knowledge. They understood metaphysics deeply enough to recognize that creation is eternal pattern rather than just historical event. And they understood philosophy deeply enough to recognize that ultimate origins transcend the very language used to attempt describing them. So they marked the boundary. They preserved the silence. They acknowledged the mystery. They trusted future generations to recognize sophistication in absence rather than mistaking it for ignorance. 5,000 years later, we can finally understand. We can appreciate the wisdom in their restraint. We can recognize the integrity in their refusal. We can honor the sophistication in their silence. The Sumerians never described the first beginning of humanity. And in that systematic, deliberate, philosophically sophisticated absence, they created something more valuable than any origin story. They created a model of intellectual integrity that has never been surpassed. They showed us that honest acknowledgement of limits is the foundation of genuine knowledge, that marking boundaries clearly is more important than pretending to transcend them, that silence can speak more truly than words when words would falsify, that absence can preserve more faithfully than presence when presence would distort. This is their gift to us, not an origin story, but something better, a demonstration of how to think about origins honestly, how to approach fundamental questions with integrity, how to preserve truth by knowing when language reaches its limits. The first beginning remains undescribed in Sumerian texts, forever, by choice, by design, by philosophical necessity, teaching us still 5,000 years later that sometimes the wisest answer is acknowledging the question transcends answering. Sleep now with that final understanding. Rest in the silence that preserves what description would falsify. Dream in the absence that speaks more truly than presence. Trust in the Sumerian wisdom that knew when to mark boundaries and honor them. The first beginning of humanity remains undescribed, and that is exactly as it should be, as it must be, as the Sumerians in their profound wisdom knew it must be. They never described it. And in that refusal lies their greatest achievement, their most profound teaching, their most lasting gift. The silence remains, deliberate, sophisticated, true, waiting in clay for 5,000 years for us to finally understand. Good night. The first beginning remains where it belongs, beyond description, beyond falsification, beyond the reach of words that would diminish what they attempted to capture. In the eternal silence where the Sumerians, wise in their restraint, chose to leave it. And now you know why. Completely, finally, truly. The Sumerians never described the first beginning of humanity because they understood something we're only now beginning to relearn. That truth sometimes requires silence. That knowledge sometimes requires acknowledging its limits. That wisdom sometimes means knowing when not to speak. Sleep well in that wisdom. The Sumerians preserved it for you. Across 5,000 years, in systematic absence, in marked boundaries, in philosophical sophistication disguised as simple refusal, they knew. And now you know too. The first beginning remains undescribed, forever, perfectly, as it should be.